Okay, so I have cached a few frames, and although it's not bad for a default simulation, there's a few things that I would like to tweak. First of all, if you take a look at what's happening underneath the water surface, we have a huge amount of particles being emitted, and most probably those are bubbles. So one of the first things I think I'm going to do is optimize these particles or delete the particles that won't be visible. That way, when we cache them, we won't be using up unnecessary space. So before we continue, let's make sure we have this add state attributes option on. This will be very important later on. Another thing that I'm noticing is that the particles are clumping together and we're not getting enough details. So that's another thing that I'm going to look into. And as I have mentioned before, most of the shaping of the white water will be found under the foam properties. So let's take a look at these properties first. Remember that by default, enable density control is on. So I will turn this off. Remember that enable density control would try to keep the particles apart, and I think this is one of the reasons they're spreading so much. Another thing that I usually turn on is enable erosion. Remember, this will try to erode or delete particles that are lingering by themselves and thus creating more defined streaks. And lastly, I will turn on enable repellent. Another very important thing that we need to consider is the lifespan of these particles. So let's go back to our emission, scroll down and check the lifespan value. In this case, the default of 5 might be a bit too low, so I will increase it to 6.5. And before we commit to another flipbook, let's take care of the bubbles that are being generated. So if we take a look at our camera view, we will be seeing much of the surface of the water, but we won't be seeing what's happening underneath. So we can optimize this scene not only by deleting the bubbles, but also by clipping most of the particles that are being submerged. So let's take care of that now. The easy part will be to clip the particles that are below the surface using the particles domain. So let's select our whitewater solver. Let's go into our limits tab, scroll down, and we can unreference this limit size Y value. So you can press Shift Control and click on the value to break this link. Now let's bring the size down, let's say to 24. And if you see now, we will clip a lot of the particles that won't be rendered. And this can save a huge amount of disk space once you start caching them. So let's go a little lower. Let's start with 22. And I think that will be enough for now. Now, the other part, removing the bubbles or the particles that are below the surface, is not that straightforward, but it's not very complicated as well. For that, I'm going to use a pop wrangler. So I will move aside this whitewater object. I will add a merge node. I will connect this merge to the third input. And I will drop down a pop wrangler and connect this wrangler to the merge node. So let's call this node kill by depth. Let's change its color. And for now, I will paste a code that I used in my final scene. And what this code will do is sort the particles that are below the water surface and delete them. So let me explain the code. First of all, we have an if statement. And this here is the condition that needs to be met. So if the depth attribute of the particles is below a certain range that we will define in a moment, the particle will be removed with this function. So remember, we have used the remove point function before in this series. So remember, this 0 represents the current geometry or itself, and this is just the point number that will be deleted. So let's go ahead and create the interface for this channel. Let's click on this button to the right. And now we will have this min depth channel. What I did is used a value of 0.25. And remember, I'm negating this value. If you take a look here at our condition, the depth must be less than minus 0.25 in this case. So before I create another flipbook, let's recap what we have done. I created a pop wrangler that will delete the particles that are below minus 25 units under the surface of the water. I also changed the main foam parameters. So here under foam, I turned off enable density control. I turned on enable erosion, and I turned off enable repellents. And finally, I'm clipping some of the lower particles using the limits. So what I did is I decreased the vertical size of the domain and thus clipping most of the particles that won't be seen through the camera. Okay, so now I will go ahead and create another flipbook and come back in a few minutes.